Hi, everyone, and welcome to Shadow Magazine's workshop, A Guide to Ethical Interviewing. This workshop is a self-directed asynchronous version of a live workshop that we held in February that we wanted to share in this format for accessibility purposes, and so folks from around the globe can engage in their own time and pace. Before we get into the actual contents of the workshop today, I wanted to share a bit about who we at Shado are. Shado is a lived experience led community of artists, activists, organizers, writers, and more united in the fight for collective liberation. We're a multimedia platform who believes in amplifying those on the front lines of social change, and we believe that those who have experienced an injustice are often best suited to advocate for meaningful change within that space. Shadow is primarily an evergreen publication that prioritizes working in line with responsible and accountable journalistic practices to avoid creating reactionary journalism that reproduces the same harm that it seeks to critique. A bit about me. My name is Jeevan, and I'll be facilitating today's session. I am a culture journalist and editor based in so called Vancouver, Canada. I'm a senior editor at Shadow and the co curator of our mentorship program, where we support unpublished writers from across the globe from communities who have been traditionally gatekept from media spaces. A bit about what brings me to this work. I have been working in journalism for about 4 years now, and I realized pretty early on into my career that I was interested in approaching the production process and relationship building with sources a bit differently than what the norm is. I've seen a lot of value in integrating approaches to producing journalism that center safety, community care, and transparency, which is what we'll be digging into in our session today. A brief overview of what we're going to be looking at in today's session. We're going to be presenting a set of counter approaches and tactics to conduct journalistic interviews that challenge norms in mainstream reporting. We'll be reviewing some technical considerations when arranging interviews with folks involved in liberatory movements and those directly impacted by oppressive systems. And we're going to work through some scenarios and exercises to brainstorm new pathways for ethical journalistic practices. To be clear, today's workshop is meant to focus on folks in community, folks, like I mentioned, who are directly involved in liberatory movements or impacted directly by oppressive systems. This approach that we're going to lay out today is different than how we would approach interviewing folks who are representing powerful institutions or the government. It's more for folks who maybe have less experiences with media or who traditionally and historically their communities have had harmful experiences with media, and about rethinking the way that we approach those interactions. Up top, I think it's really important to acknowledge that today's session is not meant to be prescriptive in nature, but rather to provide strategies and options that journalists can add to their toolbox and use wherever possible. And where the editorial process at Shadow makes space for these tactics, it may not be feasible or acceptable to implement elsewhere. And more than anything, we hope today can spark some reflection and discussion about how we can approach interviewing and center community members and their safety in the process. This is, like I said, an entryway, and we totally respect that each publication has their own way of navigating these nuances. This is still a learning process for me. I'm still understanding what my process looks like, but hopefully this can be a place where we can start thinking through how we're approaching these relationships and this way of telling stories. The agenda for today, we're going to be looking at why ethical interviewing matters in the first place, interview request processes, pre interview approaches. There'll be time to pause for a break. We're going to look at transparency, safety, and accountability, post interview strategies, best practices after publication. And in our live version, we had a question period, but we'll have a final question for you to take back and reflect on as well. So, why in the first place should we interview ethically? The legacy of traditional journalism is inherently extractive and exploitative, which has led to the misrepresentation of marginalized communities and harmful stereotyping and increased danger for those who offer their name and experience to a story. When someone takes the time to sit and share their experiences with us, it is an immense privilege. Every day, folks on the front lines of injustice and their social movements place trust in us to amplify their stories with care and compassion. This creates a power dynamic between journalists and sources, which is important for us as journalists not only to acknowledge, but to actively work to offset. As journalists, we have a responsibility to approach the work with respect and care in order to create what we call a liberated media ecosystem, which is a concept we'll return to in a moment. There are strategies we can implement at all stages of the journalistic production process to create more transparency, to create more accountability, which is kind of the initial jumping off point for today. So, I mentioned the term liberated media ecosystem. When we talk about extractivist, exploitative practices in the industry, one way that can look is helicopter journalism. Helicopter journalism is this process of journalists entering a community without a real grasp of the stakes for those being interviewed and then leaving without seeking to maintain longer term relationships with that community or their movement. At Shado, we're passionate about building what's instead called a liberated media ecosystem, which aims to use storytelling as a tool for collective liberation. The idea here is that by using more holistic, thoughtful practices and building longer term relationships, including through ethical interviewing, journalists in a liberated media ecosystem work to actively support their sources and their movements through the stories they tell and how they tell them. So, an extension of that is we hope to build a more sustainable, meaningful, and we hope to build more sustainable, meaningful, and reciprocal relationships between interviewers and interviewees. This not only helps us tell factual and representative stories while building coalitions on the left, but also helps us support a trust based media ecosystem instead of a fear based one. So, this is a quick overview of the production process, the journalistic production process. This is one way that a piece of journalism can come together. And to be clear, the production of a journalistic output, whether that's media, broadcast, a written article, digital work, is not always linear. It's not one size fits all, but we'll be using this life cycle of a piece just to help structure today's session. And a reminder that ethical practices can be implemented at every stage of this process. So it starts off with pitch, and then we go into preliminary research, interview requests, continued research, interviewing, editing, writing, rewriting, image sourcing headlines, and bringing us all the way up to publication. So this is an opportunity for you to sit down and reflect. Maybe we'll pause the video after I explain, and you can jot down a few of your initial ideas before we return back. When might you turn down a story, and how do you know if you're the best person to cover a topic? I'll ask you to pause, take 5 minutes, jot down some ideas, and then we'll come back here. Okay, so now that we're back, take a moment and reflect on what came up for you. The reason this question is so interesting, particularly as it relates to ethical interviewing, is a lot of the times the way we approach an interview can be informed by why we picked up the story in the first place or why we decided to take a commission in the first place. So before even taking a commission, it's important for us to ask ourselves, do you have enough knowledge and understanding of the nuances and sensitivities required to tell the story with care? Is this an opportunity to pass an assignment to a peer who is better positioned to write about the topic? Will this interview support the person you are interviewing, or are your motivations driven only or primarily by personal career ambition? This is really important at the outset in terms of how we navigate an interview itself. If we don't have the nuances, if we don't have an understanding or the knowledge to tell the story with nuance and care, it's going to make the interview process a lot more challenging, but also a lot more precarious for the person being interviewed. That is a huge part of trust building in the journalistic process. And I know sometimes one of the things that came up in our live version of the workshop was the question around how to know who is the right person and who isn't the right person. And I think how you approach a story and the questions that you have at the outset of the story will really tell you a lot about whether or not you're the right person to tell this. Do you have already a strong idea of who you're going to approach for interview? And do you have a reason for why? Do you understand the intersections within this topic? And if you're someone who, at the beginning, of researching on a topic or thinking about a commission has no idea where to begin or has no idea of another journalist who would be well suited to cover this, then it might be something that's outside of the scope of your community practice. And so it's worth reflecting on. So now we're going to move forward into the interview request process. Before we even start with requesting an interview, it's important for us to remember that, like we said before, journalism has real life impact for people and the communities who trust us to tell their stories to the public with care and consideration. And there's no story, no byline, no gig that's more important than someone's safety. And so consider these elements before even making a first point of contact with the source. Ask yourself, does this topic put my source at risk in any way? Does it increase their precarity in any way? Is there any potential for them to be harmed by the story that they're telling us? And this can be because of a variety of reasons, including immigration status, risks to their employment, threats to their person, or etc. And one thing to really think about, if the answer to any of this is yes, is is offering or granting anonymity an option at your publication. At Shadow, we're quite liberal with our granting of anonymity for sources. If we know that there's any potential for someone to experience harm, that is certainly an option that's available within our editorial process, but we recognize that not all publications are the same. And so, before even reaching out to someone, depending on the kind of story that you're hoping to tell and amplify, it's worth talking that through with your editor, so that folks know that that is like a pillar of support that they have available to them right away. Your initial point of contact, your initial request to a source, is a great opportunity to build trust and encourage open communication throughout the interview process. So here are the key sort of bare bones of what you should include in an initial interview request, and we'll be working with these ideas more. But it's important to think about how these things are framed. So a brief introduction of who you are and who you're looking to interview, the publication and the angle of the piece, approximate length of the interview and desired format, whether that's phone, Zoom, in person. If you're working on a strict deadline, it's good to include that as well, and offer a further conversation to answer any questions. Now we're going to be moving into a bit of an exercise to unpack different approaches to requesting interviews and how they might impact sources. So let's take this scenario, for example. Here's an example of an interview request that a journalist might send out. I'll read it out. Hello, Anna. My name is Sam, and I'm a journalist working on a piece about the recent anti Indigenous protests at the University of British Columbia this past weekend. Are you available to meet for an interview on campus later today or early tomorrow about your experience as a counter protester? Thanks. All the best, Sam. So, some guiding questions that I'm going to invite everyone to pause and take a second to reflect on, take a few minutes to reflect on, sorry. What are your initial thoughts and reactions to the request? What stood out to you? What does it do well? And what would you change about how you approach a potential source for an interview? I'm going to take a minute, invite folks to pause, jot down some ideas, and return back in 5 to 7 minutes. Okay, going back to our example, there's a few things here that feel maybe sticky and uncomfortable about the way Sam decided to approach a source. One, there's no look at what kind of piece they're going to be writing. They haven't really included the publication that they're working with. They asked if they're available to meet on campus later today or early tomorrow, which is a pretty tight turnaround, and kind of made an assumption about what location would be most comfortable for them. It's also a bit unclear of what the angle of their piece is, whether this is going to be a piece that's supportive of their cause or not supportive of their cause, and overall feels quite rushed and without as much care as maybe could be afforded for a situation like this. And I think the best way to illustrate what this example does maybe poorly is by looking at another example. So here is another look at a kind of interview request, which I'll also invite you to pause and jot some ideas around what this does well and what this could maybe improve on. So I'll read it out. Hello, Anna. My name is Sam again, and I'm a journalist for Shado magazine, a lived experience led digital publication that publishes stories about resistance and collective liberation. I'm currently working on a written story about the recent anti Indigenous protests at the University of British Columbia. I saw your post as a counter protester and wanted to see if you were comfortable speaking with me or if there's anyone in your network or organization you could direct me to who would be interested in being interviewed for the piece. The interview would take about 15 to 20 minutes, and I'm happy to conduct it in whatever way is most accessible to you, in person, via Zoom, or by phone. I'm happy to send over discussion points in advance for you to review prior to the conversation if that's helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you for your time. All the best, Sam. And so, right away, this example is very, very different. So let's go over some of the differences here. We have the title of the publication, Shadow Magazine, not only written here, but also hyperlinked. That's the line underneath. Hyperlinked to the homepage or a recent article that feels relevant and reflective of the tone and the kinds of stories that are being told. There's an explanation of what Shadow is. It's a lived experience led digital publication. The digital part is really important, so folks know that it's going to be a story that they find online. We've included that it's written, which is a big difference. You can find different kinds of stories online. Broadcast stories can be also, published on socials. We haven't assumed that they are the best person to talk to for the story. We've asked if there's anyone in their network or their organization that would also be comfortable or might be better positioned to be interviewed for the piece. We've given an approximate time commitment, about 15 to 20 minutes, and we've offered to different options for how to meet so that they don't feel like meeting in person or meeting on the phone is the only way that feels safe for them. We've also included openness to chat more ahead of time. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and that can be framed differently. It can be, I'm happy to hop on a call ahead of our interview if you have any questions or concerns. But this is an example of how we can be setting the tone right away for more openness and just more transparency around the process. A lot of folks don't know to ask that they can to meet in person or on the phone. And so how this is framed makes a really big difference in creating, I guess, a more welcoming and open environment with the source. So, managing expectations. It's important to be transparent with sources so you aren't over promising and under delivering. And that can look like a lot of different things. It can look like being clear about a desired publication date. If you know your editor wants to have something out the door at a certain date and you know that your interview has to be conducted by a certain date, these are things to be transparent about. It's important to also discuss how much their story will be centered in the final piece. Is this a reported piece with multiple sources? Is it a profile? Is it an analysis piece that is going to lean heavily on research as opposed to first person narratives? And making sure that that's proportionate with how much time you are asking them for is really important. If we're spending, multiple hours having a formal interview and we know that it's probably only going to result in a quote or two, then that's not really a fair gauge of how much time a person might want to be, putting into an interview. We can also be letting them know that headlines and cover images can be suggested by journalists who are writing a piece, but they are most often written and sourced by editors. That can be really important because images and headlines are often what folks get their attention first grabbed by. And a lot of them, if fellow journalists are joining us, know that can be driven by search engine optimization and driving engagement. And a lot of the times that can mean that parts of the story that maybe weren't the most salient from the actual piece itself are being pulled out and broadcasted for engagement, or to be more activating for people. And so understanding and building that rapport, explaining that to a source and letting them know that you'll do the best to advocate for an image that they perhaps want to have included is just important to have for trust building and for transparency purposes. Okay, so now I'm going to invite everyone to pause, take a few minutes, and we'll join back here in about 5 to 10 minutes when you want to continue. Okay, and so when folks are ready, we will move forward into our pre interview process. And a part of responsible pre interviewing is an ethical pre interviewing is maintaining transparency, safety, and accountability. So, one thing I've realized in my time as a journalist, particularly as a journalist who primarily works in community spaces and with folks who have been marginalized, folks who are racialized or traditionally gatekept from media spaces, is that there is a rational distrust of media. That is completely justified and, like I said, rational based on the extractivist and exploitative history of media, and misrepresentation within media. So, particularly when we want to engage with folks who are skeptical of talking with media, every interview is an opportunity to empower folks to take control of their stories. It's also a chance for you as a journalist to demystify the process and remind them that it is absolutely their right to be selective in what they share with you. A lot of times folks don't know that they're allowed to say no to a journalist. They're not there is that power dynamic there. And so by being forthcoming about what a source's rights are and what they're allowed to ask for and allowed to challenge a journalist on, can be incredibly helpful. So, before the interview formally begins, this can be when we're on the call, at the beginning of the call, and we haven't actually started a recording yet. The way that this is like an example of how I might approach a pre interview with a source. And this is not exhaustive at all. There are probably things that I am missing here, and there are probably versions of this in a lot of your practices as well. So, what I like to do is hop on the call and just quickly thank them for their time, and then review the intention of the interview and the sorts of questions that I'm going to be asking today. I like to remind them that they are always allowed to decline to answer a question that makes them feel uncomfortable, ask to rephrase, or pause to think. I also think it's really important to remind folks that for me personally, as a journalist, I have absolutely no interest in publishing anything that makes a source feel unsafe in any which way. And let them know that after the interview, if anything is making them anxious or uncomfortable, that they are welcome to chat with me and I'm happy to strike things from the record after the fact. That can be something that not a lot of publications are open to. And a lot of the things that I talk about, it may not be in line with what some publications are comfortable with, but these are particularly helpful when you're in the writing phase. So before you've even filed a piece with your editor, being able to strike things from the record and go back and alter things based on what a source wants is really important. Moving into post interview practices. There are a variety of strategies and tactics that we can use after an interview to ensure that ethical practices are being used. This can look like a few different things. Sharing drafts and tricky quotes ahead of publication can be really impactful. So, what this looks like is literally writing your draft, sending it over to your source if you have the time and the ability, and asking them for their feedback, asking them if this feels accurate and reflective of their experience. This is not something that's typically in line with a lot of publications. And this is something that's ideally done before you've filed a story with your editor, just for timeline purposes, because once an editor's in, a lot of the times they might struggle with the fact that a source is changing the flow of a story or is pulling something that they're uncomfortable with. I think that particularly sharing drafts is important because it is such a skill to be able to communicate what's going on in your world or in your life in a way where you know exactly how it's going to come across on paper. And that is not something that folks who haven't engaged often with media, it's something I'm still learning and I'm a journalist. It's not something that folks who are just speaking from the heart are thinking about. They're trying to just be honest about what they've experienced. And sometimes that looks really different written down on the page. And so giving someone the opportunity to look at it and be like, yeah, I said that, but that's not how I meant it. This is how I meant it is incredibly powerful and incredibly important. Again, respecting source safety over the best story. And kind of what I've been talking about and mentioning throughout this workshop is how some of these tactics that we're talking about might come in opposition with some editorial processes at other publications. And I think it's important to acknowledge that for some editors, utilizing these processes might quote unquote weaken a final product of a story. It might mean removing elements of a story that are more activating for folks, that are more agitating for folks, that are maybe more clickbaity for folks. And recognizing that in respecting their agency and by refusing to like lean into these kind of easy pulls for attention and respecting and creating an environment where the source feels as good as possible about the story and about how their story is being told is creating a better story. It is creating a more responsible piece of journalism. And recognizing that in doing that, and you might have to have some difficult conversations with your editor, and it's a part of the work of a journalist to navigate that. We kind of talked a bit about transparency around image sourcing, which it will be a similar conversation post publication. If you know that there's an image that a source has taken or that you can approach your source with, and get their okay on, or if they have any concerns about certain images that are often used to tell their stories, that is something that you can bring up and hopefully engage in a conversation with your editor about. And of course, timeline and major content updates. So if there's a dramatic change to when the story is going to be live, if the story gets pulled, if there's anything that impacts them and how the story is going to be told, just encouraging open communication, checking in with them, letting them know, keeping them up to date on timeline is best practice, to be very honest. Okay, so we're going to move into our final activity for today. We're going to be working through a scenario that will kind of help us apply some of the tactics and strategies that we've been exploring throughout today's session. So, here is a bit of a scenario for you. Let's imagine you're a freelance journalist working on a lived experience driven piece about the injustices of the ICE detainment process in the US with the BBC. You've scheduled a long form interview with a key source highlighting the conditions and obstructions of justice throughout their time there. What are some key considerations for you ahead of the interview, and what strategies would you want to implement? Let's take 5 to 10 minutes to pause here, and then we'll come back and explore the scenario a little bit more. Okay, so now that we've had a few minutes to sit and reflect on this example, let's talk about some of the things that came up in our live workshop for this. There were so many great questions that came up from this scenario, and probably similar ones came up as you were jotting down examples. This example actually has quite a lot of ambiguity, which a lot of folks brought up. It's not clear who we've scheduled a long form interview with, who this key source that we're talking about is, what the conditions look like, and how we are going to be having an interview. Like in what format, sorry, we'll be conducting the interview. And so some things that came up were, is this someone who is actively being detained, or is this someone who is working for ICE, which would be a very different kind of interview? Is this someone who requires additional safeguarding in any way? Are there any kinds of resources we can connect the person with, which could be difficult depending on circumstance? Questions about language came up, which I thought were really interesting. Is this interview being conducted in English, and is that person's first language? If not, is that a language that you speak? And if not, is there a potential to pass that story off to a journalist who does have lived experience within a similar community, or as like a common language speaker, or shared language speaker? How are we documenting the interview? How are we transcribing it? Is it audio recording? Is it video? And what kinds of checks and balances are in place so that, the source can actually review the interview material ahead of time? Have there been discussions around checking in with them prior to publication? Or is there going to be difficulties around ensuring open communication down the line? These are all things that, you know, are vague because of the scenario, but are worth considering. And so ensuring that these questions are at the top of your mind. Is this like a feature piece about this person? And have we had a conversation about what is off limits and what's not off limits? Again, these are all really great questions. And there's actually a second part of this scenario that I want to give us some time to pause with. So we're right here, we have this interview scheduled, and a day before your deadline. So we've conducted the interview a day before your deadline. The source tells you they do not feel safe. They no longer feel safe sharing their story, even with anonymity. What might be your next steps? So I'm actually going to invite us to pause again, take a few moments to reflect, and then we'll come back here and talk about it a bit more. Okay, so now that we've had a few minutes to think about this scenario, we'll come back and kind of explore it a bit more. This is a scenario that happens. Sometimes a source has conducted their interview, they feel really called to tell their story, and circumstances might change for them that make it not possible for them to tell it anymore. Or honestly, as it gets closer to publication day, it just feels scary. It feels uncomfortable. They don't want to do it anymore. And in a scenario like this, the main action moving forward is to pull the story, which is tough. It can feel tough as journalists who's put a lot of work into it, but we have to remember that the main objective is source safety. That's always the most important. That's paramount. And so if someone doesn't feel safe, even if they just don't feel comfortable, that is so, so important. Their comfort, their safety, their agency and how their story is told, and if their story is told, matters the most. And so what that looks like is telling your editor, having a conversation with your editor, letting them know we no longer have permission to tell this story, and it gets pulled. And it's as simple as that. One thing that came up in the live workshop that was really interesting was utilizing this as an opportunity for curiosity and to check in on safety with your source. So if someone abruptly is like, I can't do this, just checking in, asking if there's anything you can do, asking how they're feeling right now, and just being someone who cares on a human level is incredibly impactful. Now we're going to move into the last stage of the publication process, which is post publication. So your story's live, and here are a few things to keep in mind when it comes to like relationship building with sources that might be helpful. After it's live, make sure you follow up with them, keep them in the loop, send them a link, and thank them again for their time. Encourage open communication between the source and yourself, and reach out occasionally. Encourage them to reach out if there are any changes with their movement, or if there's anything that you can support with further coverage on. Ask them if there's been any updates on their calls to action. Is there any way that you can continue to amplify their work moving forward? And can you, as a journalist, continue to support them? We understand that this kind of relationship building with sources, it takes time and energy for a journalist, but we find that it's really important, particularly at Shado, and it's something that we like to center in our process. And so, if you're someone who's contributing at Shado, even just leaving an organizational email or leaving another referring contact to someone who they can reach out to in the future, even if it's not you, can be really helpful in terms of organizational relationship building and support. We ended with a question period in our live workshop, which we encourage you to reflect on. And hopefully, those questions that came up for you at the end of this workshop are ones that can spark further reflection, that can spark a further kind of internal interrogation of the ways in which we're approaching the work and how we can continue to learn and grow. And just a closing question for us to think about is how can we as journalists utilize these learnings to create real meaningful change moving forward? And ultimately, that's the goal. I think a lot of the reasons why we're so passionate about creating a liberated media ecosystem, I mean, primarily for collective liberation and justice, but also because meaningful change is creating real meaningful change that centers communities, that centers liberatory movements, is the goal of this work for so many of us. And sometimes it can come down to the interactions that we have with communities and how we as journalists approach it. I remember when I was starting out, I thought there was like a way to do things. I thought that there was like one prescribed way to be a journalist and that we had to have these certain processes. But the more I learned and the more I worked, particularly in independent media, the more I learned that everybody has their own practice and everyone is approaching the work in a different way. And being able to build your own approach, to build your own ability to stand up for your work, stand up for sources, challenge editors is really important. It really, really helps the work. It supports the movements. And I think that's the most important thing. So I really encourage you to take some time to ask yourself how we can create real, meaningful change through ethical interviewing and through relationship building with sources that looks different, that might look different from the status quo and the norm. And yeah, I really encourage folks to reach out to Shadow if there are any questions about today's workshop. If anything felt unclear, And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to engage with this work today. It means so much, and we look forward to seeing you at another workshop soon.